The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of IRONCLAD, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
So this guy comes in, he basically gives us a full statement. Tells us that, yeah, I've been making grenades for the Sinaloa cartel. He estimated about 800 at that point. He got caught with 114 disassembled grenades in his tire. He admits that he was taking the AR-15 rifles, which are semi-automatic rifles that people buy in the United States. He was converting them to fully automatic rifles in Mexico. He admits that he was doing the same thing with the AK-47 variant rifles. So we get a full confession. The U.S. Attorney's Office orders us to let him go. The very same prosecutor, by the way, who was the lead prosecutor in Operation Fast and Furious. So, I mean, it was mind-blowing what was happening there.
We cut through the partisan talking points. We're not interested in perpetuating fear. We're interested in seeking truth, hearing what's really going on America's borderland. Welcome to Borderland, an IRONCLAD original. Today we're bringing you my conversation with Pete Forcelli. Pete is a retired Deputy Assistant Director of the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. He's become widely known as a whistleblower for the Operation Fast and Furious scandal and wrote a book called The Deadly Path: How Operation Fast and Furious and Bad Lawyers Armed Mexican Cartels. It was an outstanding conversation. I think you guys will enjoy it. I learned a lot about this that I thought I knew, but I didn't. So, hope you enjoy. Pete, seriously, on this podcast, we talk about many different issues with the border, right? So it has layers of stuff that when you talk about the border, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to smuggling, when it comes to trafficking, when it comes to the laws and everything else.
Right.
But this topic is kind of fascinating. I'm not sure how much the ATF actually works on borders too often, but this one pulled your story into the border, and so now you're a part of the podcast.
Well, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Pete, if you don't mind, for the audience, can you give a brief bio of yourself?
Sure. I spent 35 years in law enforcement. Started as a uniformed cop, walked the beat in New York, back when they had a New York City Housing Police Department. Walked uniform for about 5 years, plain clothes for 2 years. Then I went to the Detective Bureau with about 7 years on the job. Still housing. Julianne hadn't merged departments yet. So I spent a few years as a generalist detective. The merge happened in 95, wound up going to the N.Y.P.D, still stayed in a regular precinct detective squad doing general investigative work. Then about 3 years in, I got asked if I wanted to go to the homicide squad, which you don't say no to that offer, right? So I went into the Bronx Homicide Task Force, and it was there I started to work on a lot of federal cases because New York had finally come to the realization that they had a gang problem. They were in denial for years. They had one, they just didn't want to say they did. So I started working a bit with ATF, with the FBI, with DEA, even did a case with the Department of State. Got a taste of the federal system, really liked it. And after about 4.5 years there, I decided to jump ship and go to ATF. So I started as an ATF agent in New York City, spent about 6 years there, went to Phoenix, which is where I got my taste of working stuff on the border. So I oversaw roughly 10 agents in Phoenix, plus a few task force officers from the Phoenix PD. Had a couple of deputy marshals assigned to work with me, an HSI agent, which back then they were called ICE. They weren't HSI yet. Yeah. And I also oversaw a group of 4 agents in Yuma. So really spent some time on the border. But anyway, after 5 years there, I got kind of caught up in blowing the whistle on something really ugly I saw there, which I know we'll talk about. Got thrown out of Arizona, wound up in headquarters for a short time, then bounced up to Canada for 2 years, which was awesome because Canadian cops are like the coolest people to hang out with. They work hard, they play hard. I'm surprised my liver survived that assignment, candidly. Came back to headquarters for a year, then went down to Florida for 3 years. I was the assistant special agent in charge of the Miami office for about 18 months. Then I was the special agent in charge of the Miami office for about 2 years. And then I got shipped back up to headquarters, and I rounded out my time with ATF as the head of training, which was awesome because I got to go down to the academy 1 week a month and see all the fresh new faces who hadn't been like pounded down by the bureaucracy and the politics. And I think that's what kept me going the last few years is, just having a hand in welcoming them aboard and having conversations with them, and trying not to be that bureaucrat who didn't care about the new folks coming in. Like I really tried to connect with them, which was really great for me spiritually as well. Just, have that connection with the next wave of people wanting to go out there and do the job. But yeah, and then I retired in October of 2021, and here I am.
Yeah, and you just recently released the book, right?
Yes, correct. I
The
couldn't
book is
write the
called
book while I was with ATF, so that's why, I had to wait because of legal reasons.
Yo, absolutely. It's called The Deadly Path: How Operation Fast and Furious and Bad Lawyers Armed Mexican Cartels. And I haven't picked it up. I said I was going to pick it up. I haven't picked it up. I need to pick that up because I'm excited to read it. It aligns a lot with a lot of the stuff that I've been researching and reviewing and digging into. There's something in your notes that you didn't mention. I want to ask: is this true? You're a first responder during 9/11, and later developed lung cancer. Is that right?
Yeah. I was there. I got there shortly after the first plane hit on 9/11. Spent, the entire day on site through the night, worked through the night, into the following day. And even to part of the third time down there, third night. And then I didn't get home till day 3, like on the morning. But yeah, wound up there, lost some friends, lost 7 friends, 6 cops, 1 firefighter. They told us the air was safe. Then lo and behold, roughly 2018, around August, I got diagnosed with lung cancer. So they took out the right lung, all the cancer, thank God, with it. So I didn't have to go through radiation and chemo, which, those two things in of themselves can be, they can kill you. So I was blessed in some ways, not that I feel lucky to have had lung cancer, but I got off easy compared to a lot of people I know who've died as a result of 9/11 related injuries.
Yeah, and I just think it's important to mention because your history and your career is outstanding. It's something that I think it's legendary, and to add that on top of someone who's a responder of 9/11, it's historic and unfortunate that you did get cancer. But I know a lot of people who were there that day. This has the same issues, and so I just want to make a note of that, man. I thank you for your service, man. That's a huge deal to me. I was home watching when the planes hit, and it actually was part of the inspiration of me eventually joining the military and then moving into Department of Homeland Security with Border Patrol. And so you're one of the foundational members who was out there doing their part. So thank you for that.
Well, no, thanks for your service. Because look, reality is when they killed my friends, it was folks like you that went back and took the fight to them. So I'm
Yes,
always
sir.
grateful for our military, man. They're my heroes.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. So, Pete, if you already described your roles at ATF. When you went to Phoenix, you said that was the first time you started managing guys and working the border. What are some of the things you saw in your time as an ATF agent?
Sure. Well, I started as an agent in New York, and I mostly worked on gang-related cases, largely on home invasion cases, which was when you had drug crews robbing other drug crews just so they could sell the drugs for entire profits. So I'd worked on roughly 200 gun cases by the time I got to Arizona. What blew my mind in Arizona was really 2 things. One was what was happening at the border. Because, when you're in New York, big city, you focus on what's happening in your area of responsibility. I had no idea how porous the border was, how much cross-border stuff was happening with the cartels. And this is 2007 when I got there, early 2007. The other thing that blew my mind is I worked really well with prosecutors because to be a good agent and to be successful, you need that partnership with federal prosecutors. You need subpoenas, you need court orders. You need them to sit there with you for hour upon hour to sit through proffers. When I got to Arizona, what blew my mind is that partnership was almost non-existent. Like, there were some federal prosecutors that I met who were good people, but the folks who we were tasked with working with in the gun unit weren't, at least not initially. And then eventually they brought in some people later on that were optimistic and, they wanted to do the job and they'd come from Maricopa County Attorney's Office. But even them, after a while, they just got beaten down. And it was some of the stuff that I saw there that I found to be so appalling because as the body count was growing in Mexico and we were generating cases, we couldn't get any traction. And, and it's one of the reasons I wrote the book is I think that was a path that was paved that helped really lead to what caused Operation Fast and Furious to even happen. And it doesn't excuse Operation Fast and Furious by any stretch. But it was just like a complete failure of the federal criminal justice system in Phoenix on a level that really blew my mind. And I thought I had seen it all. Being a homicide detective for New York, surviving 9/11. I hadn't. It's a shocker.
How much time did you get to spend on the actual border? Is that a lot of your investigations took place down there?
Well, my group was tasked with investigating Mexico-bound firearms trafficking. So we spent some time on the border, but we spent most of our time focused on the dealers, the gun dealers. When I say dealers, I mean licensed gun dealers operating in Phoenix, in Yuma, in a large part of Arizona. And, for the record, those dealers were good people. They used to call us. They would tip us off when they saw something suspicious. When someone would come in with a bag full of money and ask for every AR AR-15
Yeah.
or every AK variant rifle they had on the shelves, they'd call us. They wouldn't just make the sale and let it ride off into the sunset and then call us later. Like they really cared about public safety. So we would follow these folks after they would make these transactions. We would execute car stops. We would catch them in lies. We would do what cops do all over the country. And sometimes that work brought us down to the border. And it was just, to me, just mind blowing to see what was happening at the border, especially with Mexican aduana, which is, for the listeners might not know, it's customs. And I even had some opportunities to go into Mexico to meet with some of the law enforcement people down there. And some of them were genuinely good people. Some of them were, kind of sketchy, shady folks. You had to learn who you could trust, who you couldn't trust. But the violence down there that I used to see, like, in these National Drug Intelligence Center bulletins and whatnot, it would rival anything that you read about in the Middle East during the war on terror. It was mind blowing.
When I was working, there was a lot of, we were trying to do a lot with southbound guns. A lot of guns were going back south. Is that part of some of the task forcing that you were doing as well? Is that not just guns coming in, but guns coming out?
Well, we were only working on guns going out because there's not many guns coming into the United States from Mexico. It happens when the cartels would bleed into the U.S. doing stuff like transporting drugs up. But our role was almost exclusively to try to stop the guns from going to Mexico. And that's what happened with the whole Fast and Furious scandal, was that they weren't stopping those guns. And we know what happened with the hero. I mean, Border Patrol agent Brian Terry, former Marine, Bartak guy, elite, just like a rock star of a law enforcement officer. I wouldn't even just narrow that down to Border Patrol. I mean, this guy was unbelievably fit, just like he's what you would look for in a law enforcement officer. And what happened to him highlighted kind of this strategy that they developed in late 2009, early 2010. That was, it went against the grain of everything we believed in.
Well, let's talk about it, right? If you can, for the audience, explain what Operation Fast and Furious was, and then we'll get into the details more later. But for those who probably don't know the story, would you mind telling us that?
Sure. Well, if you watched the news back then, you heard it was either something that was created by President Obama and pushed down, and then the Democrats said, no, this started under George Bush and continued. Both of those are not really true in any way. There's stuff that was happening that spanned both administrations that was, not great. But this was a case that started in late 2009, because what happens is federal fiscal year, as you know, but your listeners might not, goes from October to October, right? So in October of 2009, my group, which was the Mexico-bound firearms trafficking group, we were repurposed. We were focusing from that point on home invasion robberies, because Phoenix became the capital in the United States in home invasions and kidnappings in 2009. And obviously, that's not a distinction any city wants. And they were only second in this hemisphere behind Mexico City, which is a city of like 20 million people. So it was crazy. So our purpose was changed from interdicting firearms heading to Mexico to home invasions. So this new group was stood up. Now, in our time, like I was telling you before, the dealers would call us. They would give us a call. We would roll out there. The transaction would not happen until we were outside. They would sell to these shady folks. We would follow the car, stop the car, ask questions. And almost none of these transactions were legit, because we would ask the questions. We would confirm this. We weren't just taking guns for the sake of taking guns. We were taking guns from criminals. So the problem was almost nobody was getting prosecuted for this, because we would call the United States Attorney's Office. That they would decline prosecution. They would come up with all different reasons. And if you read the book, you'll see some of these cases where there were body counts on them already, and they just didn't want to be bothered. So, but what happened with Fast and Furious is this new group took a different approach. Rather than stop the cars and ask the questions, they were documenting these sales and letting the guns leave. Like, they weren't interdicting them, which we had a problem with. Like, the reason we always interdicted guns was because if a bad guy had a gun in his hand, we didn't know. Would it be pointed at some cop? Would it be pointed at some kid? Would it be used in a home invasion? So again, if we weren't trying to take guns from honest Americans, but when we knew they were trafficked towards cartels who were killing other people, we would do our job. With this new case, the philosophy became different. So, and we didn't know about this in the other groups, frankly, until like Brian Terry's death, when one of the agents in that group started talking outside of the group. But they were documenting these transactions. And let me
ask some.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Let me stop you real quick, because I want to make sure that I'm clear on this. So, Operation Fast and Furious, there was many different ATF agents under that same umbrella doing that operation. And what you're saying is, one group of that, one small group, I guess one entity of that operation was doing something slightly different.
Not exactly. See that, and that's what the media wanted everybody to believe. With that, this Fast and Furious was this big thing. Fast and Furious was a case. It was actually the name of the case was called Jacob Chambers et al., which Latin for and others. It's an abbreviation. That case focused on a small group of straw purchasers, and the nickname of the case came from the fact that these guys drove like those souped up cars, just like the movie,
Yeah.
like they Japanese cars. So, there were 7 groups in Phoenix. My group was a criminal enforcement group that focused on, at this point, home invasions, previously Mexico-bound trafficking and Aryan Brotherhood stuff. Then there was Group 2, which was a general group. There was an intel group. There was an arson group. Then there were 2 groups that did like compliance stuff. They weren't agents, they were inspectors. So this new group that just stood up in 2009, like I said, around October, was Phoenix Group 7. Within Phoenix Group 7, Operation Fast and Furious was being run. Not everybody, even in that one group, was down with the plan. Like there was a lot of animosity that was contained in that group. Some of it we didn't know about because they didn't sit with us. They sat in a different site with DEA. Not that DEA was involved in the case. I'm not saying that. So, but I mean, we didn't hear the things that you would hear at the water cooler. Like we didn't know what was going on until around the time that Brian Terry passed and an agent named John Dodson came forward to say, hey, they were walking guns. And then, but around this same time, though, the same dealers that were calling us, they never had their guns traced because once the guns left their store and we did those car stops, they came into our custody. So what's important to know is like when a gun shows up at a crime scene, whether it's in the US, whether it's in a country that we have a memorandum of understanding with, that gun is traced. And the way trace works is someone from that agency will call ATF and say, hey, we found this gun. Can you trace it? ATF will then call the manufacturer and say, hey, can you tell me if this Glock Model 19 serial number ABCDEF was made? When was it made? Where was it shipped? So the manufacturer will tell ATF, and let's say it was sent to Pete's gun store, Pete's, wholesaler. They'll call the wholesaler. Can you tell us when you received this gun, where it was sent to? And that trace will continue until the first retail sale, right? But the call goes at that point to the dealer, and the dealer says, yes, I had the gun and I sold it to Pete Forcelli, as an example. So what happened is all of a sudden around the time of Brian Terry's death, a lot of these dealers who weren't getting those phone calls because the guns were being interdicted are starting to get phone calls from ATF saying, hey, your gun was traced. So they actually called for a meeting with ATF and with the U.S. Attorney's Office and said, hey, what's going on? Like, we don't understand. We've been doing this with you folks for years, meaning ATF, not meaning my team. Now, all of a sudden, our guns are getting traced. Like, what gives? So folks who were at that meeting, to include federal prosecutors, which is important to remind folks, said, hey, man, don't worry about it. We're doing something different this time. Keep selling. So here you have these dealers who were trying to do the right thing, who were good Americans up until this point and still were in their mind thinking they were helping law enforcement do its job, who were told to continue to sell guns that aren't being interdicted, unlike the gun situation when we were working those cases. So now some of those same dealers are actually being sued by the government of Mexico for doing exactly what the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Phoenix ATF folks from that group told them to do, which went against the grain of everything that we had learned as ATF agents. In fact, it was funny because when you talked about the original rumblings of guns walking, most people were like, no way, that's not how we operate. Like, to include the attaché in Mexico, who's a good guy. He helped infiltrate the Hells Angels with that J. Dobbins case way back in the day. A guy named Carlos Canino, solid dude. He's did a lot of undercover. He's no pushover. He's no yes man. So he was down there, and even when he came up to Phoenix for a briefing, he's like, Pete, there's no way that this is happening, because at this point I'm starting to think John Dodson was telling the truth. And I'm like, Carlos, I think it is. He's no way. So I actually was there when Carlos read the operational plan for the arrests in Operation Fast and Furious, which happened way too late. And Carlos almost physically got sick right there because he couldn't believe that people would authorize such an idiotic operation to happen. So
that was my next question. So who authorized the ATF to allow them to just let the guns walk and then to hopefully let her trace it when I guess the other question is, they're only going to be able to trace it once they identify that gun has been in a crime, correct?
Right. No, and that's the most amazing thing. And part of the strategy of the case was, as the case went on, again, I wasn't in that group, but I started to hear what was happening in that group, was they figured if we can start tracing back some of these recoveries to cartel activity, and we can tie these straw purchasers to these cartel networks, then we can take down this cartel like network of firearms traffickers. to me, that was mind blowing because, and again, you're from the border, you understand that area. DEA had a very robust network of intelligence and teams within operating in Mexico itself. ATF didn't have that. We had like a handful of people, like 6 people. We didn't have access to the vetted units. We didn't have access to direct access to some Mexican law enforcement entities. We had no ability to track any firearms once they crossed the border. So the only thing they would rely on is traces, which means you're finding a gun next to a body. Now, it was approved. It was approved by the head of the ATF Phoenix office, and it was approved by the U.S. Attorney's office. In fact, the same prosecutor who was driving the Operation Fast and Furious investigation was the same guy who for years told us that once a gun crossed into Mexico, they couldn't prosecute it because the body of the crime, being the gun, was in Mexico. So, I mean, that blew our minds because, like, wait a minute, all of these years that we were told once, if a gun was recovered in Mexico and we would be able to identify the straw purchaser and the trafficker and get confessions, and that happened from time to time. And I spell out some of those cases specifically in the book. We were told, well, the gun's in Mexico, we can't prosecute it. So wait a minute. Now, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the strategy becomes to let the guns go to Mexico. And then the other thing, and it's a case I discussed in the book as well, we had a guy who we identified who was taking grenade parts from the United States, right? And they're not illegal to own an inert grenade. You can sell them at flea markets or whatever. And people use them to make all kinds of weird things. So, but, crossing the border with them is violations of the Arms Export Control Act. Well, we had a target that we identified we believed he was making grenades in Mexico, but we weren't sure. Was he making, something else here in the United States? Was he making grenades in the United States? Well, he got caught crossing the border with 114 disassembled grenades in his tire. And as you can imagine, so they x-ray his vehicle. And when they see these, they don't know, are these live grenades or these inert grenades? So they do what you would expect them to do. They lock down the border. They call it a bomb squad. And when you shut down the port of entry, that's a big deal. Yep. And as you know, the plaza bosses who really control the border, they see this happening. So this guy comes in, he basically gives us a full statement, tells us that, I've been making grenades for the Sinaloa cartel. He estimated about 800 at that point. He got caught with 114 disassembled grenades in his tire. He admits that he was taking the AR-15 rifles, which are semi-automatic rifles that people buy in the United States. He was converting them to fully automatic rifles in Mexico. He admits that he was doing the same thing with the AK-47 variant rifle. So we get a full confession. The U.S. Attorney's Office orders us to let him go. The very same prosecutor, by the way, who was the lead prosecutor in Operation Fast and Furious. So, I mean, it was mind-blowing what was happening there. And when you think about it, absolutely. And when you think about it, look, guns and these grenades, they're not perishable items. They're not loaves of bread. They're not apples, oranges that are going to rot or decompose. They're going to be there until they get recovered at some crime scene or in some search warrant. So, I mean, the whole concept behind the operation was seriously flawed and went against the grain of everything that I think any law enforcement officer in the country believes in. But they ran this case for some time. In fact, one straw purchaser in that case, and for your listeners, a straw purchaser is somebody who goes into a gun store and buys a gun with the intent, like they go in there and they buy a gun with the intent on giving it to somebody else, right? So it's not like I go buy a gun, I take it to the range, I don't like the recoil on it, and I say, this is just not for me. Or, hey, I got a new baby in the house, I don't want to have a gun around. I mean, people sell guns for a variety of reasons that are legal. To go in and buy a gun specifically to sell it to somebody else is not legal. So these straw purchasers, that was their MO. They would go in and buy a gun with the intent on giving it to traffickers. One of the straw buyers in Fast and Furious, a guy named Osorio, bought over 800 guns before the U.S. Attorney's Office decided he was worth prosecuting.
That's
so
crazy.
I mean, it's absolutely. And here's the tragic part is, had Brian Terry not been murdered by cartel bandits doing his duties on the border, patrolling, looking for cartel bandits, that case might have went on for far longer. But it was at that point that John Dodson, who was in that group, blew the whistle on Operation Fast and Furious that they were walking guns, because we didn't know they were walking guns in the other groups. And then it was at a subsequent meeting amongst the Phoenix command staff that I was present at, when Bill Newell, who was the special agent in charge of the Phoenix Field Division at the time, came back and said, hey, I would advise you folks to steer clear of John Dodson. The U.S. Attorney's Office is really pissed off at John for talking to Grassley staff, because that's who John called, was Senator Grassley staff. And they hinted that they might indict John Dodson. And here I am saying, wait a minute, all these firearms traffickers that we referred for prosecution, that they made excuses as to why they couldn't prosecute. Again, some with bodies on the cases. Now they're going to indict John Dodson. And that's why I went home that night, had a stiff glass of tequila and a chat with the wife. And the next morning I called Senator Grassley's office and said, hey, I know you're being told by Eric Holder and by DOJ and by ATF that John Dodson's lying. I'm telling you, I'm here and he's not lying. And, I'm willing to chat with you, give me a subpoena. And I mean, eventually they did. But it was at that point that I had enough, because it went against the grain of everything that I'd learned as a cop and as an agent. And the people who I loved and respected in the profession believed as well. That's what kind of pushed me over the edge.
As Ironclad Originals launched a couple years ago, John was always on our short list of kicking things off. This has been the project that we've been looking to do for a while. This is Dave Ramsey meets John Rambo, where you get to call in and get answers to the most dangerous questions that you have.
What should I do if I hear shots ringing out?
Or what I should do if there's a major terrorist attack.
How is your faith tied in to being a protector?
Is there a moral case for taking a life?
What is your recommendation on critical EDC?
What should I have? What's the best?
What should I do?
What does that look like?
What would you recommend? Is there anything I could do?
How long was this Fast and Furious going on before the Brian Terry incident?
Well, the case started, like I said, in 2009, around October of 2009. Again, I wasn't involved in the investigation itself, but I know the agents are, and the lead agent in that case had worked for me prior to them standing up this Group 7. So I figured Brian Terry was murdered in December of 2010.
14,
so the case went on for a year to 14 months prior to Brian Terry's death. And again, the same U.S. attorney who was involved in the grenade case was one of the driving factors, one of the architects of the Fast and Furious strategy.
Yeah, it's crazy because I guess my initial thoughts on it, I didn't understand where they got the guns originally. I didn't know that they were purchased from gun stores. I didn't know that. I thought the operation somehow had kind of set up a gun buy or something in the case. So it's even more interesting to hear that the old I guess SOP, standard operating procedure, would be to allow them to buy the guns. You communicate with the gun store, and then boom, you pull them over, and boom, you collect the guns, and now you have the people attached to the guns, and boom, from prosecution. So now the new system in this small group was to allow them to purchase a gun and just let them go, so that eventually, if they kill someone, they could identify that gun and where it went to after it's already been used, unlawfully, which is like mind-boggling. And those of you who are listening right now, Brian Terry was a BORTAC agent assigned to Tucson sector. There was an operation they were doing, I believe it was called Huckleberry or Huckleberry. What that operation was meant to help stop the scenarios that were happening on the border. They were RIP crews. RIP crews were coming in and taking drugs from other smugglers. And so they were known to be violent at some points. They were known to carry guns at some points. And during that operation, once they went to apprehend the individuals, there was an engagement, and Brian Terry was killed because of that engagement. And that is what later was investigated, that rifle that killed Brian Terry was a part of the Fast and Furious scenario. Correct.
Right. And like I said, it wasn't until Brian's death that we started to hear about what was happening, which is terrible. Because again, there were countless Mexicans being killed with those firearms. There will be people killed with those firearms, because 2,200 roughly firearms were trafficked in that case, and only
2,200.
Yes, 2,200.
Wow.
And from a variety of dealers. And what happened is these dealers were in communication with ATF. So if you think about it, like some people say, well, this was dealers. Well, this was dealers acting at the instructions of ATF agents. So keep selling, keep selling. So in essence, it's no different than if ATF agents themselves were selling guns, because you're acting as an agent of the government, which is so appalling. And like I said before, some of those dealers who did exactly what they were told by federal prosecutors and ATF agents are now being sued by the government of Mexico, which is another completely appalling story. So, I mean, it's a mess on so many different levels. But there's one other thing that I think is important is and I'm not justifying what the agents did. There were some instances where the agents on that case, and I didn't learn this then, I learned this after I testified when I had a conversation with one of the agents that was actually involved in the case. And it was like, there were a couple different occasions where they wanted to stop cars, and the lead attorney on the case would say, well, listen, we understand that these targets have purchased many guns in the past, but how do we prove in court that this particular purchase isn't for their own personal benefit? Which,
Oh, wow.
yeah, right, but exactly, it's an excuse. Now, what my problem with that is, we never asked for permission to stop a car and to ask those questions and to get confessions. So that's not an excuse that I really put much credence in, because why were you even calling and asking? And the other thing that's somewhat even more disturbing is, they were up on wiretaps on some of these targets. So in some instances, they knew that these people were going to buy guns at these dealers before they even showed up to buy them. And I'll give you one more. There was one incident where at the Scottsdale Gun Club, which is in Scottsdale, Arizona, very cooperative to us. They were good people. It's an above board location. You know, they weren't shady by any stretch. But the traffickers, the straw purchasers are in there, and they see the ATF surveillance outside. So they start to get alarmed because they're just straw purchasers. You know, they're not hardcore felons. I'm not excusing them. They're criminals because they're committing a crime. But so anyway, they think they're about to get ripped off because, as you know, the cartels, they're kind of shady characters. They rob each other. So they call the Scottsdale police. So the Scottsdale Police Department, unbeknownst to them, shows up, has a conversation with these straw purchasers, right? Not knowing they're straw purchasers. They gave these traffickers a police escort away from the scene because they thought they were legitimate people buying guns who were afraid that they were going to get robbed. Instead, you had ATF agents watching the Scottsdale police give an escort to straw purchasers off site so that those guns could go where they were going to go. I mean, it shocks the conscience.
Yeah, it's insane. I've never heard this part of the story. I'm excited to read your book. This is just fascinating. The individuals who were involved in this, you know, was any kind of punishment brought on to them, or is this something that's still an ongoing investigation?
Oh, no, there's no ongoing investigation. The only thing that's still ongoing is that all the guns that were seized as part of that case that have been recovered are still in ATF custody. They haven't been destroyed yet. That I know. Look, some people were fired, right? Were they the people who deserve to be fired? No. Like some people in headquarters who should have known, and I'm not excusing them, you know, like they were deputy assistant director, a guy, Bill, that I worked with in New York, dude was a hero on 9/11. He got jammed up because he trusted his boots on the ground people in Phoenix, never really was paying attention. So they jammed him up. He got canned. So did the director was removed, right? The deputy director, who was a well-respected guy, again, not paying attention, not excusing it. You know, you're at that level. You got to own the people's mistakes. So those guys all got fired. One GS-15 was fired. He was in Arizona. The special agent in charge was demoted to a GS-13 position. The case agent remained with ATF. No real discipline. The prosecutor, who I would argue, and I got to be careful how I said I don't want to get sued, but he was the architect of the Fast and Furious investigations prosecution strategy, declined many cases that we presented to him where, like I said, there were body counts growing on these traffickers, and who was the person who made us let the grenade trafficker go. He's still an assistant U.S. attorney in Phoenix. And one of his mentors, who has some blood on her hands as well from some of the earlier cases that I document in the book, she's the number 2 of the Phoenix U.S. Attorney's Office right now.
Shoot. How has the Fast and Furious impacted our relationship with Mexico? Has it caused any issues?
Oh, of course. You know, and I'm going back to a gentleman I mentioned earlier, Carlos Canino. You know, he was, now I'm not a big fan of the current administration in Mexico. They've taken a much softer on the cartels approach than the previous administration. But my friend Carlos, who I really didn't know that well back then, he was very close with the Mexican Attorney General. I believe her first name was Maricela. She was a woman. She was pretty aggressive when it came to going after the cartels. And, you know, Carlos, when they heard rumors that guns were walking, Carlos met with them and said, no, that's not true. That's not how we operate. So that's why I was talking about before. When Carlos came up to Phoenix for that big takedown and he read that operational plan, one of the reasons that Carlos almost got sick is he was very, very good friends with the Attorney General. of Mexico. They had a great relationship. She was very good to us. Like, she helped us big time on the Kingery case, the grenade case I mentioned, huge, where she may have saved some of my people's lives by sending in reinforcements when they were executing a warrant in Culiacan. But Carlos had to go back and tell Maricela, his friend, that, yeah, we did walk guns, because he was saying all this time, no, we don't do this. This is impossible. He initially thought John Dodson, the first whistleblower, was a liar, as did most of ATF, which John wasn't. He wasn't a liar. So, but yeah, he had to go back and tell her, yeah, all that stuff you were hearing is true, which was a difficult conversation for him to have. So obviously the Mexicans were pissed, and deservedly so. I mean, I would have been too. I can't see how you find any other way around that.
Yeah, how many of their citizens are potentially killed because of these rifles? 2,000 plus rifles coming into their country.
Not just citizens, cops. I know of a Mexican helicopter. I'm not sure if it was military or law enforcement that was downed with a 50 caliber rifle that was trafficked as part of the Fast and Furious investigation. I know of a big shootout. It was publicized. I mean, it was on the news, where some American tourists were in a resort in Rocky Point, which is not far from the Arizona border, where a helicopter, a Mexican gunship, is engaged in a gun battle with cartel people, and these poor tourists are YouTubing it from their balconies.
Oh my goodness.
And guns in that scene, and a grenade, by the way, in that scene, came back to the Kingery case. So, I mean, yeah, they have every right to be pissed off. And look, people are still dying down there as a result of the guns that were trafficked as part of that case.
Jeez almighty. What's currently being done to prevent the cartels from using American guns?
Well, there's a lot happening. I mean, there's interdiction efforts that are happening. There was something actually that was recently released by DHS and DOJ where they've seized a bunch of guns. But here's where they're falling short. Prosecutions of the straw purchasers are still at a rate that's laughable. Like, in their press conference, when they talked about the seizure of hundreds of thousands of firearms that were bound for Mexico, they are bragging about prosecuting 150 straw purchasers. Well, there's at least 125 ATF offices around the country. So that's a pretty abysmal number. And, I mean, if they're not prosecuted and there's nothing on their criminal history, they can continue to buy guns to send down to Mexico. So I know law enforcement is trying to interdict things, but they're at the mercy of prosecutors at times. And look, the other thing is, Mexican Aduana still does what the plaza bosses want them to do, because they don't want to get killed, because they, again, it's not right, but it's not wrong. If I knew at the end of my shift, if I stopped the car and interdicted guns, that some plaza boss was watching me and I'm going to get executed and have my family executed as well, I might not be that aggressive as a cop either down there. But so, I mean, there's a lot of layers to this onion that just have to get fixed before this ends. And look, I think we can both say with some certainty the cartels have become much more influential, much better armed, much more powerful now than they even were when I left Arizona in 2012.
Yeah. How do you think they're getting their weapons now?
Well, there's still some straw purchasing that happens, and it's not just something that's on the borders. It's something that happens in all 50 states. That's one methodology they use, and some folks will dispute that because, but it's a fact. I mean, I've seen the numbers. They're getting some guns that are coming out of law enforcement and military thefts in Mexico, right? Because the cartels have people in the military, and so they're stealing them from their stores. There's some guns that are coming up from Central and South America. And I've heard rumblings, although I haven't seen any hard evidence, that even some of the guns that we've left behind in other parts of the world are starting to show up in Mexico. And look, I don't think that's a stretch, because if you look at the cartels, especially the Sinaloa cartel right now, they're global conglomerates. I mean, they have a presence in every single continent on the planet, to include, recently I read something about them causing some problems in Australia. So, I mean, these people that operate these cartels are experts in smuggling. So just like they're experts in smuggling stuff into the United States to include humans. Tobacco, by the way, is a new thing for them. Tobacco products.
Really?
Yeah. The Sinaloans and the CJNG both are estimated to have made $4 billion in tobacco smuggling last year.
What are they smuggling? Just like cigars or like dip?
I couldn't tell you exactly, but I know tobacco products based on the reportage that I've read. So, but I mean, obviously money and guns south, but I'm sure guns come from other parts of the planet too, where they have a presence. I mean, they have the money with deep wallets and pockets. You can do a lot of things.
Yeah. Yeah. No kidding. It's crazy to think. The guns thing is just wild. So when you decided to come forward, did you face any challenges with that? Have you got any death threats and whatnot?
Death threats, no, but it was interesting. Like, the way it works is when you get subpoenaed, the first thing they do is they bring you in and they give you a deposition. So I was deposed in front of staff from Senator Grassley's office. Senator Leahy, who was the senator at the time, he was the chairman of Judiciary. And then on the oversight side, it was Darrell Issa. He was the chairman of the Oversight Committee, and Elijah Cummings. So they're not them, but their staffs, which are all lawyers, interviewed me in a room in a hotel, not a hotel room, but like a room that they rented, like a conference room. And so it was about a 6 to 8 hour interview. And I remember I laid everything on the table, all the stuff that's in my book, because there's a lot of stuff that preceded Fast and Furious that'll really upset you when you read it. So I laid it all on the table. And before I even walked the 6 blocks back to where my car was parked, because I parked at the office, I got a phone call from a prosecutor saying, hey, everything that you just said in that room was relayed to the United States attorney, who obviously did not fare well through that whole mess. He was the chief law enforcement officer for the feds in Arizona. He had a hand in it. So I knew I had a problem at that point. A couple of days later, I got a call from another prosecutor in the office, because some of them were good people that wanted to do their job, frankly. So I met him. He slid an email across the table to me, and I'm reading it. And I'll try to get as close to verbatim as I can. But what it said is, anyone, it was to all of his staff, the whole U.S. Attorney's Office, anyone running into Pete Forcelli, even if it's on the weekend having a cup of coffee with his family, will report it to me through your chain of command immediately. So so like this point, you realize, okay, they got a target on me. And then not too long after that, I started getting surveilled, where I was followed, sometimes in a very overt way. So then you wonder, was it the OIG? Was it, private investigators? Was it some, into ATF internal affairs? Like, I had no idea. I still don't know who it was, but there were times where, I would notice them in the rearview mirror. But then there were times where they made it obvious. Like, I take my family out, and I remember one time we were sitting at a restaurant, and it was one of those restaurants where there's like a bench that runs the whole wall of the restaurant, and there's various tables. And this guy was like literally sitting to my right, and he kept looking at me and my family. He's with another guy, and they just kept staring at us. And here I am with my wife and my 2 kids. It's scary. And then, like, you think, well, maybe I should confront them. And it's like, well, that could get ugly if I reach for something. So you don't know how to handle something like that. And then when I actually testified in front of the committee, the actual hearing, which was on C-SPAN, not that anybody watches C-SPAN, right? But while that was happening, the chief of the criminal division accused me of perjury. So now I was under investigation for perjury.
Damn.
For telling the truth. Thank God I could document everything I said. But and then they subpoenaed him. He pled the 5th and resigned. So I guess you can't plead the 5th unless you're guilty of something, right? But that continued for 4 years. For 4 years, I found myself under investigation. But look, I followed some good advice. Don't get political, and don't speculate. Don't embellish. So I just stuck with stuff that I could either prove with documents or that I had witnesses to. But it took 4 years and six times where I volunteered to take a polygraph, which is insane.
Damn.
To clear my name. Yeah, it was rough.
Man, it's insane to think that could happen in America, and we can be careless about it. Has there been some new parameters put into place so that the ATF couldn't do that again?
Well, when the Phoenix command staff got removed back when Fast and Furious was still kind of when it was first blown up, they removed all the special agent in charge of the 2 ASACs. A new command staff came in. They fixed a lot of things there. Eric Holder appointed a guy named B. Todd Jones to be the director. He came in and really fixed things. It took a while, because you don't turn around a battleship on a dime. But him, and he had a deputy director named Tom Brandon. They came in and they really we focused on going after violent people and not letting guns walk. So they changed things. The culture changed a lot. Unfortunately, right now, there's some other political things happening that, concern folks. But yeah, I mean, things changed, but it's like a pendulum, like any other law enforcement organization or any administration. Things change and then they change back, and you got to just make sure that people are staying honest,
Absolutely. Man, that's really all the questions I had for you today. Is there anything else you'd want to tell the audience that you want to just mention?
Yeah, just briefly, when this scandal happened, the reasons I wrote the book, there's a couple. One was if you watch the news, you heard the Democrat version or the Republican version of what happened. So the real version never really came out. So I want folks to know, because I'd get approached by agents who were agents with ATF during that time. And then some folks we hired afterwards would say, hey, what really happened? And we even proposed, like, why don't we put together some sort of training so that it never happens again? You know, like the military does, after action report and whatnot. And we were always told, no, we don't talk about Fast and Furious. We don't talk about Fast. So the reality is a lot of people, even within ATF or within law enforcement, don't know the real story. So that was one reason. And then the other thing, and it was something that really bothered me, which, you know, I hope I brought them some peace, although I know I didn't give them all the answers they want. I sat next to Josephine Terry. Well, not next to her. We sat at the same table as Josephine Terry, Brian's mother, when I testified on June 5th, 2011. And I got to meet his cousins and whatnot. I've since spoken to his brother, had communication with his sisters, but never spoke to them. These are good people. I mean, these are like just honest people, the people you want living next door to you, just nice human beings. And, you know, Josephine's son died valiantly. You know, he died in the line of duty. He was a great American. And in many ways, all they wanted was answers, you know, and they were just disrespectfully treated by our government. So one of the reasons was to help maybe give them some answers. So, and I hope I was able to accomplish that for everybody. I hope everybody sees what happened. It never happens again. And I hope that, you know, people will remember Brian Terry for what he was, which was a hero. Because, I mean, I'm a firm believer. A hero only dies the last time his name is mentioned. So if people read that name in the book, keeps his memory alive, then mission accomplished.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that. Brian Terry had a big significance in my career, and actually it's what pushed me to join for the special operations of the Border Patrol as well. So the story is close to home, you know, and I really appreciate you telling the story. I'm excited to read the book. Genuinely, I appreciate your time, sir.
I'm honored to be here, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Borderland, an Ironclad original. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. We'll see you next week.